a nuestra invitada. Hoy, para inaugurar la presentación del 9º Informe FOESSA, tenemos el inmenso honor, la profunda alegría de contar con una invitada verdaderamente excepcional. Es un auténtico privilegio que haya cruzado el océano para acompañarnos hoy presencialmente en Madrid. Les hablo de la profesora Joan Tronto. Para quienes trabajamos en el ámbito de lo social, buscando claves para una sociedad más justa, el nombre de Joan Tronto no es solo una referencia académica, es una inspiración. Joan Tronto es profesora emérita de Ciencias Políticas en el Hunter College y en el Graduate Center de la Universidad de Nueva York, y es profesora en la Universidad de Minnesota. A Joan se le han concedido distintos doctorados honoris causa por la Universidad de Estudios Humanísticos de los Países Bajos y la Universidad de Lovaina, en Bélgica. Y es una de las pensadoras más influyentes del mundo en el campo de la filosofía política y social. Su contribución fundamental, y por la que es mundialmente conocida, es haber situado la ética del cuidado en el centro del debate democrático. El trabajo de Joan Tronto ha sido revolucionario por algo que como científicos sociales y como agentes de cambio entendemos profundamente. Ha logrado sacar del cuidado del espacio privado, de lo doméstico, donde históricamente había sido invisibilizado, había sido feminizado y devaluado, para convertir ese cuidado en lo que realmente es, en un pilar central de la justicia social y en un asunto político de primer orden. En un tiempo marcado por el individualismo y por la fractura social, retos que diagnosticamos en nuestros informes, su pensamiento nos interpela directamente. Nos recuerda que somos seres interdependientes y que una sociedad no puede ser justa ni cohesionada si no organiza y valora políticamente el cuidado de la vida y de nuestro mundo común. Su trabajo conecta directamente con el corazón de la misión de FOESSA y de Cáritas. Compartimos la búsqueda incansable del bien común y de una sociedad que ponga a las personas, especialmente a las más vulnerables, en el centro. Es autora de obras capitales como Límites morales o La democracia del cuidado, donde nos ofrece herramientas no solo para diagnosticar, sino para proponer. Hoy tenemos la inmensa suerte de que comparta con nosotros su reflexión con una ponencia que no podría ser más pertinente para esta jornada, una ponencia titulada La democracia del cuidado, cómo las ciencias sociales pueden contribuir. Estoy seguro de que sus palabras nos iluminarán y nos inspirarán en nuestra tarea. Sin más, recibimos con un enorme y caluroso aplauso a la profesora Joan Tronto.
Gracias.
A ti.
Buenos días. Forgive me, my Spanish is so bad it would be tortuous for me to speak in Spanish. I want to begin by thanking the Fundación FOESSA for inviting me, for providing me with a plane ticket, and for hospitality. Thank you, Marina. Thank you, Raúl, for the wonderful opportunity to be here. I'm really excited to be here because this report is excellent. Can you hear me? You see? Okay. I've read the resume, and I thank you so much for this work because it confirms the deep and important wide measures of inequality, of understanding economic, social, and political dimensions of living well. Truth be told, I could not agree more with the finding that you'll find on the top of page 92. Care represents a critical frontier for contemporary social justice, implying a shift from private matter to a common good. Addressing this challenge requires considering care as a common good, not a private burden. The horizon of a community-based care model involves decisively investing in accessible, flexible, context-appropriate local services, improving working conditions in the sector by professionalizing and adequately remunerating care workers, defeminizing the responsibility for care by promoting its redistribution across genders and generations, and forging public-community alliances that strengthen mutual support networks without placing the entire burden on families, period. Okay, my work is done. I sit down, I thought. But it is on page 92, not page 1, so I guess there's still something for me to say. In my talk, what I want to do is argue a little more about how we might arrive at a more completely caring democracy. We're living in a world that is urgently in need of a caring democracy. Now, let me define caring democracy for you. There are 3 main points. First, instead of thinking of democracy as a support for the economy, you remember Bill Clinton's famous remark, "It's the economy, stupid," we need to recognize that including everyone means finally overcoming the public-private divide, instead of seeing that everyone is involved in both as care receivers and caregivers every day in their lives in relationships of care. We need to have a political language of care, not an economic one. Second, we need to reorganize caring responsibilities, because much of daily caring work and most caring responsibilities fall disproportionately on women and men and women from lower social positions, while others have enjoyed what I've called privileged irresponsibility of ignoring or deflecting or refusing their caring responsibilities. Care responsibilities need to be reorganized so that everyone accepts a fair share of the care. And thirdly, we need to use democratic means to arrive at these caring solutions. So, care is often not about equality. When we think of care, we think of a parent helping a child or a care worker helping an elder person. These are not conditions of equal citizens meeting, are they? So the question is, how do we make sure that care is as equal as possible? Probably we balance it out over the lifetime. We need to address institutions so that they can better provide how citizens learn to and practice care democratically. And how can all the voices, including those who are most excluded, be included into democratic care? Now, I want to begin by offering a somewhat different framing for the social, economic, and political problems that are so well detailed in the report and that Raul has summarized for you. Reading this report, one might conclude that economic practices are deeply uncaring. But I want to argue to you that the urgent need for a change comes not from the fact that the world is uncaring, but that it is caring for the wrong thing. What the world is caring for at the present, following Harry Frankfurt, I believe that everyone's moral universe is shaped by the importance of what we care about. The problem is that care in the contemporary world is directed at a truly cruel and bad form of care that I will call wealth care. So I think this is what puts this report, what is reported, into a coherent description of the world, wealth care. Now, by wealth care, I refer to a contemporary form of financialized capitalism, but rather than call it neoliberalism, I prefer to mark it as a set of values by calling it wealth care. Wealth care posits that the growth of wealth is the central value, the central activity, and the purpose of society, and that society's rewards should go to those who create and grow wealth, since they are the most worthy people in the society. It presumes that caring for wealth is and should be the most important human undertaking. Wealth is a system without limit. And even in so-called socialist regimes like China and the former Soviet Union, as well as in welfare state liberal and non-liberal regimes, everybody seems to embrace wealth care. Let me point out some features of this wealth care system. But here first, you've probably seen something like this global wealth distribution. Half of the wealth of the world is in the hands of 1% of the people. You know, it doesn't take anybody to say, okay, that's not fair. And this 1% of the people, the 50 who hold close to half the wealth, are such a small percentage of the people who live in the world. So, wealth care depends upon passing wealth on to, so let's think about this from the standpoint of wealth. What do you have to do to care for wealth? Well, the first thing you have to do is make sure that wealth can sustain itself. And wealth sustains itself. What does wealth need? It needs people who can be wealthy. But only some people can be wealthy. That is, the families of those who already possess wealth. It's interesting to think of those guys not as rich themselves, but as the caregivers for the money they hold. And that is, in fact, how they think of themselves. This makes the process, of course, familistic, heteropatriarchal. Such concentrations of intergenerational wealth perpetuate class, racial, ethnic, linguistic boundaries as well. And despite their claims to the contrary, they depend upon the state as a source of wealth. The state provides them with protection against disorder, and by provisioning the state, they are able to take lots and lots of money out of the public and put it into their private hands. And they keep the state within their control, lest it escape from their ways of thinking and tax them more and tax their wealth, which is now, of course, hidden around the globe. Now, wealth care is ultimately and deeply anti-democratic. Wealth care benefits a small number of people, and they believe they are better than everyone else. And they believe that their primary interest is to make sure that others' needs and interests don't result in a redistribution of wealth. As Nancy MacLean argued in her very important book, Democracy in Chains, the wealthy spend a lot of time and money to manipulate broad publics to continue to support their worldview. If they stop doing that, we might catch on, and so they have to keep this going. Now, political leaders in a wealth care system primarily accept a view that the task of the political order is not to serve people's needs and interests, but to grow the economy and wealth. Here's a chart, and in a sense, this is a chart that documents what's already been said about what's found in the report, that wealth is growing in a way that is unconnected to the growth of GDP, of the gross domestic product. Wealth is growing from real estate. It's growing from speculation. It's growing from finance on stock market prices going up. It has nothing to do with the actual production of goods and services or what could actually benefit people. So this chart shows that about 50% of the wealth that's been generated in the past 50 years is more than what you'd expect if wealth were just following the path of GDP. And people's interests, conceptions of their interests then become equally narrowed, and this point is also made in the report, and citizens become unable to think of themselves in broader ways than as parts of this economic system. They forget that they possess larger interests or responsibilities. When economic measure becomes the measure of all things, people think of themselves only as producers and workers and consumers and lose their capacity to think of themselves as citizens. This is how citizens become pacified. And at that moment, political leaders excite their anger, which makes them less democratic, and people begin to fall for narratives of protection, which always requires that there are some people who are worthy of protection and some people who are unworthy of protection, the threats, who have to be put down. Whenever you talk about protection, you've already created others to be despised. The end result of the current political economy, then, is that we make ourselves into passive and accepting subjects of political leaders who take their cues from what the wealthy tell them they need. When they become allied with those who greed knows no limits, it's a formula for the growth of wealth at the expense of everyone else. And that's the world we're currently living in which money comes from money. Now, under these conditions of wealth care, concerns for the health and safety of most humans, other living creatures, the planet itself becomes secondary. As wealth accumulates in the hands of the few, the destruction of the planet goes on. The need for a drastic change is obvious. And I want to argue to you, democratic caring points the way. It's an attempt to transform our public language, I'll say it again, from an economic language to a political one. Okay, so the second part, governing a caring democracy. Caring democracy offers a different model of governing ourselves. Instituting it won't be easy, and among other important changes in our worldview, we need to acknowledge the broader forms of responsibility and recognizing, as CARE does, how deeply relational our world is. This too, by the way, is mentioned in the report, how important are relationships. These changes won't be comfortable for the people who profit in ways large and small from the current way of organizing the world. And people do benefit from the way the world is currently organized. All of us do. In getting from here to there, we must first recognize that some, perhaps even many people, benefit. Now, as I argued in Caring Democracy, many people are currently excused from taking on greater responsibilities for care. An important cause of this irresponsibility is identified by the report. Point 3. The women's labor revolution and new family structures reflect a more diverse society. However, gender inequalities persist. Now, not caring has its justifications. They, mostly men, but also people in up positions in class, race, ethnicity, claim that they're engaged in more important activities. They're involved in producing wealth and protecting property and taking care of their families, in making charitable contributions. But why should these activities be so much more important for society than making sure that everyone has enough to meet their basic needs? Many people, many men, perhaps most men, benefit from being excused from the daily tasks of care. And many people are better off, are able to exercise privileged irresponsibility. Recognizing all of this requires that we put all the care responsibilities back on the table and renegotiate. Who should care for what, how, by whom, why? Now, this requires our citizens will have to articulate needs and priorities in new ways. This isn't a conflict-free process. There'll always be disputes about the best way to care. But in a caring democracy, as I envision it, people will always organize to support, and this is important, a plurality of different possible solutions, because people have different ways of thinking about what it means to care well. And so we'd want a democratic society which allows for pluralistic outcomes. The active engagement of citizens in a political process, not everyone in the same way, but spreading out duties and responsibilities, could affect a remarkable change as people go from thinking of themselves as the passive recipients of benefits to thinking of themselves as givers of receivers of care in a way in which the state plays a supportive role. Now, such a state would obviously need to be liberal. That is, you'd have to guarantee rights, the rule of law, requirements for transparency, accountability, fairness. And there'd have to be adequate opportunities for appeals and challenges for judgments. But other concerns, such as sharing resources, reshaping from the family to the workplace to political institutions themselves, all of those questions would be subject to public debate. Arriving at a consensus would create a common purpose and widespread senses of solidarity and trust. In Spain, according to the Resumen, the welfare state is already quite popular. But, and this is also in the report, citizens, at the same time they support the welfare state, recognize that their voices are not being heard. So a caring democracy is not the same thing as a more expensive welfare state. The welfare state adopted measures to share some wealth with citizens in order to maintain social order, not to transform citizens into people who take caring responsibilities seriously. Caring democracy changes the terms of democracy because it requires the active engagement of citizens. Now, in concrete terms, many policy proposals for moving forward towards a caring world have been proposed. I could have offered you a long list of care manifestos that have been written around the world in the past 5 years or so. Written in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, in the UK. One of them is the Care Manifesto written by the Care Collective. Now, these manifestos usually include such points as these. First, acknowledging and improving the conditions for care work in the political economy on local, national, regional, and global levels. Second, creating government policies that provide separate, untouchable streams of revenue for care support, as exist already in Uruguay, and which other Latin American countries have all agreed to try to reach since the Quito Consensus of 2007. The Latin Americans are way ahead of much of the rest of the world on these matters. Third, renegotiating work time and care time, either permanently, and that's the suggestion of Jennifer Nadelsky and Thomas Mallison in their book, Part-Time for All, a Care Manifesto, in which they argue nobody should work more than 30 hours a week, and everybody should care for at least 30 hours a week. Now, they don't want, they call it a norm rather than a law, because they don't want to create a bureaucracy that counts how many hours you spend caring. But the idea is to get us to flip in our minds the way that first we work, and then we work our care around what we have to do to work. Suppose we did it the other way, or at least put them as equally important. We would have a very different way of organizing social and political life. So we could do it by changing care time permanently, or, and this is a suggestion made by Andrea Doucette in a 2021 article and in a forthcoming book, we could extend leave time until it becomes much more equalizing and egalitarian. So people could take leave time for being a parent, taking care of someone who's sick, taking care of a friend, perhaps sometimes even taking care of themselves because they're in need of it. And then also providing, almost all of these manifestos mention providing a global wealth tax to raise revenues to pay for such ideas. Now, these proposals all start from the existing political economy, but there are also other proposals that try to disrupt economic structures in other basic ways. Yeah. Oh no, this is this point. So Fiona Ducaloy, Mary Murphy, and Orla O'Connor in Ireland have proposed 3 basic anchors for what they call an eco-social, careful political economy. Here's what they are: universal basic services, a participation income, and enabling institutions that would support care. While they begin from a concern about the environment and finding ways to provide sustainable work for contemporary societies, their premises also fit, I think, within the necessary structures for a caring democracy. The collective provision of basic services would be these: healthcare, childcare, elder care, housing, transport, adequate energy to meet needs, education, recreation, and so forth. Now, suppose we said part of the goal of society or the state is to make sure that everybody has enough of those basic services. A participation income is not the same thing as a basic income, which, libertarians have argued for, because, we have enough wealth, we should just give money, as Van Parijs says, so that surfers can be paid. But the participation income, on the contrary, recognizes that we are all engaged constantly in activities which, when done, benefit society as a whole. And therefore, the fact that society has produced so much wealth should produce a benefit to people to be able to continue to do that work so that they can live well. Raising children, for example, is not just something that you do because it's cool to have children and they're so cool because they're just like you. But having children is a way of investing into the future of your society. I'm always shocked when I hear people who are single and have no children, or even married and have no children, saying, I don't have children, why should I pay for school? As if they're not going to benefit from the future of having children who will grow up to be citizens and will help take care of them when they're older. So a participation income, which might begin out of payments for leave time, will make it possible for people to feel secure that they'll always be able to provide for their own safety and their own needs. Imagine if you didn't have to worry that you'd have enough to just be able to live. And the precarity that most workers find themselves in now would disappear if there were a basic participation income that people could access. And creating more institutions that would be supportive would help to regulate and oversee such work that can create opportunities for people across the lifestyle to participate in different ways. I'll give you a few examples of this. Jae-im Park received her PhD in the UK, but is from South Korea, where, of course, there is compulsory service for young men, but not young women, and it actually has created a lot of resentment, which has increased voting for the right in Korea, because young men are so angry about the fact that they have to serve in the military, and their classmates from university who are women get started in business before them. Park proposes compulsory service for everyone in the society, and those who don't serve in the military, thank goodness we don't need everybody in the military, but people who don't serve in the military could do care work. I actually think this is a great idea for another reason as well, and that is, it would give us the opportunity to mix people up from different regions, different groups, different locales, different religions, different backgrounds, could, because they were doing compulsory service, work together. It could be compulsory service for young people. Parents might earn their participation income by caring for their children and their classmates after school. Older adults might work in community gardens or serve as foster grandparents and so forth. Institutions could be created to reduce polarization online. Audrey Tang, there's a wonderful work if you're interested in the impact of artificial intelligence and what CARE might say about it. These people at Oxford have written on a webpage called The Six Pack of CARE, in which they argue that it's possible for us to understand AI from a care perspective and to control it so that it serves public interests, not the interests of financialized capitalism. You might want to check out that website. Lorraine McCrary has looked at communities that commit themselves to taking care of neurodivergent people. And state policies might create mechanisms to assess the gender and care implications of changes. For example, Care Makdmer made the suggestion of gender mainstreaming. A governmental agency to oversee care could be established to make certain that these proposals work and work together without making care worse. The important point here is that once new forms of active participation become available and widespread, they'll create an ethos to sustain themselves. And other examples exist, creating community spaces, community refrigerators. Even in design and architecture, people are using the language of care. So caring democracy isn't perfect, but it is a request for citizens to take seriously their roles of caregiving for themselves, for those close to themselves, for those further away from themselves, and for democracy itself. Now, there will, of course, be fights about the best way to achieve these results, but that's okay. Given how plural are our needs, wants, and desires, there will never be such a thing as perfect care. But these are the kinds of disputes that we should be engaging in public life. They help us to explain why we have to shift our framework and to make them more relational, as the report also argues. Finally, I want to spend a little time today talking about the accomplishment of this report and remark upon the positive impact I think social scientists can have, scientists more generally can have, when they devote themselves to helping to solve this problem. So I admit I couldn't miss the opportunity standing in the room with all of you scholars who have contributed to this remarkable report. Of course, I'm coming from a country where we don't even notice there's such a thing as science anymore, but never mind. This is a remarkable report, so let us ask the question, what could your role be in effecting a change to caring democracy? Obviously, social scientists and policy analysts are needed to assess whether such policy proposals, as the ones I've just mentioned, would work, and what obstacles might crop up to their working well. We all know that if you create a system, humans will figure out a way to get around it. And sometimes that's good, and sometimes it produces really bad extra effects. And so we really need to be able to evaluate that. There have been experiments, for example, in guaranteed income and basic income that have already occurred in many settings, and some have even compared a basic income to a participation income and discovered more positive effects when the participants were told they were receiving a participation income. So on this level alone, social scientists could make a great contribution. I propose, though, that we ask this question in assessing public policy institutions and practices a little differently. Because public policy has become a field of analysis that starts from the assumptions of wealth care. How can we get the most for our money? Let us ask not about cost-benefit analysis, but this question. Does this policy or institution create a vicious circle of unequal care, or does it create a virtuous circle of care? Maybe that seems simple enough, or maybe it's too abstract, but let me give you an example. In some places, school lunches are not free. The students come to school and buy lunch. In some places, formerly in the state of Minnesota in the US, for example, children paid for their lunch a week in advance, and if they didn't have enough money, they weren't given the hot lunch that everyone else was given. They were given 2 slices of bread and a piece of cheese. Imagine what it's like to be a poor kid and given 2 slices of bread and a piece of cheese when other kids are eating a hot lunch. It's stigmatizing. So not only is it bad that you're not getting a good lunch, it's also bad, not only is it bad because your parents can't afford to pay for your lunch, you're also stigmatized. It creates a vicious circle of bad care. Contrast that with what the state of Minnesota has now done, which is every kid who comes to school gets a free breakfast and a free lunch. Or compare it to what happens in France, where a chef prepares the school meal and everyone sits at a table with the teachers and they have a conversation at lunch and enjoy the food. Which of those is going to create people who are equal citizens? So you can see there are ways of creating virtuous circles of care or vicious circles of care, and policy analysts could really take this question and think about what our policies are doing in terms of whether they're doing virtuous or bad care. We can also ask the question, how does what we're doing fit with our other values? For example, equality, non-stigmatizing. And we can also ask, what are the qualities of relationships that our public policies are creating? If we create a policy that says everyone needs to get a job and we don't provide enough jobs, then what we've done is created a condition of competition where people are going to be fighting over these few jobs that are available. They're going to be resentful of the ones who get the jobs. This is not a way to create a virtuous circle of care. It's a way to make things worse. But beyond this, I want to make a suggestion to take social scientific work in a different direction. And here I come to the point that's really at the heart of what my current research is about, which is bad care. The world is filled with bad care. In fact, I dare say the world has more bad care in it than we could ever imagine good care being. The question is, how do we recognize bad care, and how do we make sure that its effects are diminished? Can social science help us to distinguish bad care from better care? I would argue to you that much of the work in social sciences starts from and shares the assumptions of mainstream society about what constitutes a good life. What would we want political and social and economic life to be if we were committed to equality and plurality, to seeing the relational? How can we make sure that we are not bringing in some of the ways of power, of shaping and excluding when we investigate? And even if we are doing that, is there a way to do so that's more or less caring? Now, while I'm sure these are questions that you deal with writing a report like this every day, I want to evoke the words of the great African-American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois to help me explain my concern. In an essay published already in 1897, Du Bois wrote, "Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question, unmasked through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of lightly framing it. All nevertheless flutter about it." And this is the question, he said, nobody dares ask him, but everyone wants to ask him. How does it feel to be a problem? Just as a care perspective starts from the humble everyday actions of people taking care of each other, so too care theories start from the bottom up and ask, what is the problem that we're trying to address? Is the problem care is too expensive, or that people are too needy? Or is the problem that work is organized in a way that makes it impossible for people to care well? Just as Du Bois noted that he often was asked indirectly, how does it feel to be a problem? So too social scientists exploring whether and how care affects inclusion and exclusion might want to ask whether they're asking the question the right way around. Now here, I actually think moral philosophers may offer us some help. I'll think of Bernard Williams in his book Shame and Necessity, and Margaret Urban Walker in her book Moral Understandings. They both argue that rather being abstract and universal, morality is a changeable set of claims and values that meet the criteria of being seen as moral in a certain time or place. And they ask instead, what are the disputes in our current moral understandings? Such disputes, Walker, following Bernard Williams, observes, will almost always involve different claims about power. Those are often the underpinning problematic elements of moral disputes. So let me awkwardly put the question this way. Does measuring social inclusion and social exclusion wield power. For example, is becoming a teen mother a warning sign for social exclusion, but it also masks disobedience to a series of religious and perhaps familial and social expectations. For the young people involved, it may be an assertion of a need. It may be the only way they see to have some power in the world. Their action may well look to others like a formula for a difficult future, but should it be a marker of social exclusion? Now, I'm not going to answer that question, but I do think that you have some potentially useful guidelines that occurred to me as I've thought about care over the years. So let me suggest at least 3 kinds of claims about power that social scientists can use to help us think more carefully about power. So 3 types of ideas. First, how are the needs of people actually determined, and how might they be differently determined? As long ago as 1994, Nancy Fraser and Linda Gordon wrote an essay about what they called the politics of needs interpretation. If people need to avoid dependency on government, then programs on workfare make sense, although, as I suggested to you before, they are a form of a vicious circle of care. But people's needs to avoid being dependent may now have been shifted to unscrupulous employers. So in terms of social inclusion and exclusion, a different and perhaps fruitful way to approach this might be to ask people how they feel excluded and why. Of course, the qualitative work that's already been done to produce this report is a step in this direction, and that's a really welcome step. Second, I keep going back to Albert Hirschman's work on exit, voice, and loyalty, where he explains that when you're in a situation with which you find yourself uncomfortable or disagreeing, you have 3 options. You can leave, you can say something, or you can just surrender and go along. All of those are situations, all of those are possibilities. And the choices that people make often depend upon the way in which power is being structured around them. An example that Susan Oken gave a long time ago. If divorce is very expensive for women because they can't get credit in their own names, they don't have a job, etc., they're not going to leave a marriage, even if it's an unhappy marriage. Once their opportunities become greater, their exit costs go down, which means they might leave, but it also means their voice costs go down, right? If you say to your husband, "I'm not happy," he might respond in some way other than hating you if he knows you can leave. And so the way in which exit, voice, and loyalty costs can be evaluated helps us to explain how bad a situation people find themselves in. And it may be a different way to get at the question of whether or not we are caring well for the people we think we're caring for in our social policies. Or let me give you another example. I don't want to take too much time, but let me give you another example. Some minority communities prefer to educate their children in their own schools, thereby perpetuating their own habits, customs, and ways of thinking. And it's wonderful because it honors these traditions. But let me give you an example. In New York State, the state discovered that the Orthodox Jewish students who were attending the schools set up only for those children were not learning English. They were learning to speak Yiddish, but they weren't learning English. Suppose you wanted to leave that community. Suppose you decided, this isn't for me. I don't want to be one of these guys. How could you leave if you can't speak English in the United States? So this is one example of how what looks like a pluralistic, good care decision could turn out to be bad because of the way it shapes exit, voice, and loyalty costs. And third example here. What do we mean when we say the normal that might be taken for granted in research, and how does it squeeze people into preordained characters of the normal and perhaps into a kind of bad care? I'll give you an example again from the US. Racialized midwives practiced in the early 20th century. White women didn't take care of black women weren't permitted to take care of white women in the American South. And African American women, vastly under-resourced, often used traditional methods which had survived for centuries and come originally from their African and folk traditions. But as soon as the white doctors found out they were doing this, they said, oh, we got to stop that. And they took away their bags and gave them a bag that only contained soap and bandages. And they told them, go take care of your patients. They couldn't take care of their patients that way. Of course, they had two bags. They carried their traditional bag with them and their approved bag, which they showed the doctors when they were inspected, and they were inspected to make sure they were doing it right. But that's an example of the way in which what counts as normal influences a set of practices. And as you probably know, in the United States, the mortality from birth of African Americans is still vastly higher than for other groups in the population, in part because of these ongoing traditions of disrespect that have happened. So there's three kinds of ways in which power reflects on how we care, and in which we might, as social scientists, better explore how to solve this. In a different social order, we might ask the question of how we define the problem to be solved by society then, and research what we need from ongoing public discussions about the needs of people in society. And perhaps this might change our ways of doing research as well. Let me conclude. At present, we live in a world that seems desperately unwilling to recognize what caring requires. In his famous view of the universe, Mark Zuckerberg pronounces this mantra, move fast and break things. When I hear this, I immediately think, and who do you think is going to be left to pick it up after you've made a mess? And we all know who that is. It's time for us to turn the tables on these people and on those overwhelming privileges that make them unable to see what's really going on in the world, and to instead follow the model of what care requires. Here's the definition of care that Berenice Fisher and I originally proposed back in 1990. On the most general level, we suggest that caring be viewed as a species activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair the world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to weave into a complex, life-sustaining web. Maintain, continue, and repair our world. That's the work for all of us to do as we try to live in the world as well as possible, and we need a democratic, pluralistic way to get there. Thank you for your ongoing contributions to trying to make this vision a reality. Muchas gracias. Do you want to see the references? Get out your cameras. That's page 1, there are 4. Maybe 3, I can't remember. 1, 2. Can we go on? No, wait. Okay. If you'd like a copy of the paper, there's my email address. Yeah? Page 1. Page 2. I wish I were better at PowerPoint, but I still don't think these would all fit in one slide. Page 3. Yeah. There's still some time for questions.
Pues, Joan, muchísimas gracias por haber estado aquí. Nos ha gustado mucho tu intervención y hemos aprendido un montón. Simplemente otro aplauso para ella, por favor. Y ahora hacemos una pausita para el café.